The quiet forest. Marla loved hiking in the fall. There was something about the way the forest glowed in golds and oranges that felt almost sacred. She'd been coming to the same trails every autumn for years, learning their twists and turns by heart. This year, however, was different. The forest felt off. At first, she couldn't pinpoint why. Then she realized the usual forest sounds were missing. No birds chirped in the canopy, no squirrels darted through the brush. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. As Marla walked deeper, she noticed the first oddity, the deer. It stood in the middle of the trail, but something was wrong. Its head lolled at an impossible angle, like its neck had been broken. Marla froze, unsure whether it was dead or alive. Suddenly, the deer moved. Not a natural movement, no startled leap or gentle step. Instead, its legs jerked like a puppet on strings, dragging the limp head along. Marla's breath caught in her throat as it turned to face her. Its eyes were wrong. They weren't the soft, dark eyes of an animal but pale and glassy, like marbles. She backed away slowly, refusing to turn her back on the grotesque creature. But then she saw them. More animals. A raccoon, a fox, and what looked like the shadowy shape of a bear, all with twisted necks and dead, pale eyes. They stood motionless in the brush, silently watching her. Marla bolted. Her feet pounded the dirt path, heart hammering in her chest. But as she rounded a corner, she stumbled and fell. Looking up, she saw the trees ahead. Their trunks had faces. Bark twisted and gnarled into expressions of agony, mouths open in silent screams. Some of them had eyes, and they were watching her. She scrambled to her feet and ran, this time leaving the trail entirely. When she finally burst out of the woods and into the parking lot, the sounds of the world returned all at once. The wind blew through the trees, birds sang, and somewhere, a dog barked. Marla never hiked again. The Pumpkin Patch. Every year, the McCready family ran the most popular pumpkin patch in town. Parents brought their kids, couples wandered hand in hand, and teenagers posed for Instagram photos among the plump, orange gourds. It was a fall tradition, one that brought joy to everyone, except the McCreadys themselves. Late at night, after the crowds left, strange things happened in the field. Mr. McCready often found pumpkins smashed or moved to odd places, like the roof of the barn or the middle of the road. One night, he heard soft giggling coming from the patch. Grabbing his flashlight, he went out to investigate. The beam of light swept across the field, revealing rows of pumpkins, and something else. A figure crouched among the gourds, its body blending so seamlessly with the orange and green that it was almost invisible. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its skin rough and mottled like a pumpkin surface. Its head was a large, hollow gourd, carved with jagged eyes and a crooked grin. "Hey!" McCready called, his voice trembling. The figure turned its head toward him, the carved grin widening as if it understood. Then, it stood up. It was massive, taller than any man, with clawed hands and feet that crunched against the soil. McCready ran. He didn't stop until he was back inside the farmhouse with the door locked behind him. That night, the pumpkin patch burned. Firefighters blamed it on vandals, but McCready knew better. The next morning, when the ashes cooled, one pumpkin remained untouched. It sat on his porch, grinning up at him. The Man in the Leaves. It was an old urban legend. On the first cold night of fall, when the wind whispered through the trees, you might see him. He blended into the piles of leaves that lined suburban streets, his body hidden beneath layers of red, orange, and gold. Some said he was a spirit, others a killer. No one really knew. Maggie didn't believe the stories, even though her friends swore they were true. Just don't walk alone after dark, they warned her. And don't go near the leaf piles, she laughed it off, until the night she had to walk home after her car broke down. The streets were eerily quiet, lit only by flickering streetlights. Leaves rustled in the breeze, gathering in heaps along the curb. Maggie pulled her coat tighter and quickened her pace. Then she heard it. A soft crunching sound, like someone stepping on dry leaves. She froze and turned around, but the street behind her was empty. Heart pounding, she kept walking, her footsteps echoing against the pavement. Crunch! Crunch! The sound followed her, growing louder with each step. Maggie's breath came in short, panicked bursts as she broke into a run. She didn't look back until she reached her driveway. The figure stood at the edge of the street, its body covered entirely in leaves. Maggie's eyes widened as it tilted its head, the leaves shifting to reveal a hollow, dark space where a face should have been. It took a step forward, leaves falling from its form with each movement. Maggie bolted inside and slammed the door shut, locking it tight. But when she turned to look out the window, the leaf man was gone. Only a trail of scattered leaves remained on the driveway. The next morning, Maggie's front yard was filled with piles of leaves. Too many to have come from the trees nearby. And in the largest pile, she found a single shoe. Her shoe. The hayride that never ended. The haunted hayride at Briar Hollow Farm was a seasonal favorite, known for its spooky decor and eerie actors who leapt out from the cornfields. Families and teens packed into the wagon for the bumpy ride through the fields, laughing and screaming at the harmless frights. But one year, a group of teenagers experienced a hayride that no one else had ever returned to tell about. It was the last ride of the night, and the air was sharp with cold. The teenagers, 4 of them, joked loudly as the tractor began pulling the wagon through the dark fields. The actors were nowhere to be seen, which struck the group as odd, but they shrugged it off. As the wagon creaked along the trail, fog began to settle thickly over the ground. The trees lining the path seemed to twist and lean unnaturally, their branches clawing at the sky. Suddenly, the tractor engine sputtered and died. "Looks like we're walking from here," joked one of the teens, but the others weren't laughing. The wagon was surrounded by an unnatural silence. Then, one by one, they started hearing voices. Low whispers, calling their names, coming from the cornfields. The group huddled together, peering into the fog. That's when they saw them, figures standing among the stalks, their faces obscured. At first, they thought they were the hayride actors, but these figures didn't move, didn't speak. They just stared. One of the boys, Jason, jumped off the wagon to confront them. "Nice try," he shouted. But as he approached, the figures began to twitch, their limbs jerking unnaturally. One of them stepped forward into the moonlight, revealing a face stitched together with burlap and thread. Jason screamed, and the others watched in horror as he disappeared into the corn. The remaining 3 tried to run, but no matter which way they went, they found themselves back on the wagon. The figures closed in, their movements slow but relentless. The last thing they saw before the world went black was the glint of scythes raised high. When the sun rose, the tractor and wagon were found sitting in the middle of the field, empty. The teens were never seen again, but on misty autumn nights, locals claim they can hear screams drifting from the corn. The thing in the chimney. Fall was when the Carter family lit their first fire of the season. Their small, countryside home smelled of pine and wood smoke as they gathered around the hearth to enjoy cozy nights together. But this year, something was different. It started with noises. Scratches and thumps coming from inside the chimney. "Probably just a raccoon," Mr. Carter said, tapping the bricks to scare it off. But the noises didn't stop. They grew louder, more frantic, and sometimes sounded like whispers. One chilly October night, the family decided to light the fire anyway. The wood caught quickly, and the flames danced high, crackling cheerfully. But then the fire dimmed. Thick black smoke poured out of the hearth, filling the room. "Get out!" Mrs. Carter screamed, ushering the kids outside. Mr. Carter stayed behind, trying to extinguish the flames. That's when he heard it, a low, guttural growl from inside the chimney. He froze as 2 long, skeletal arms unfolded from the darkness, clawing their way down toward him. The family fled to a neighbor's house, but when they returned the next morning, the hearth was cold and the house was silent. The chimney bricks were cracked and blackened, and inside, they found claw marks etched deep into the stone. No animal or human could have made them. The Carters moved out that same week. The reflection in the lake. The lake at Whispering Pines Campground was most beautiful in the fall. The water mirrored the fiery red and gold of the trees, and early morning mist hung over the surface like a dream. Campers often gathered there, drawn to its stillness and beauty. Late one evening, a camper named Ellie went to the lake to take pictures of the autumn foliage. The sun was setting, and the water shimmered in hues of pink and orange. But when Ellie raised her camera, something in the water caught her eye. At first, she thought it was a fish, a dark shape moving just beneath the surface. But it wasn't swimming. It was crawling, dragging itself through the shallow water. Ellie stepped closer, peering into the lake. The shape became clearer, and her stomach churned. It was a human figure, pale and bloated, with empty black holes where its eyes should have been. The figure moved closer to the edge, and as Ellie backed away, its head snapped up to look at her. She ran, heart pounding, but when she glanced back, she saw nothing. The lake was still, the water smooth as glass. She convinced herself it had been a trick of the light, but when she looked at the photos on her camera later that night, she stopped breathing. In the last picture she had taken, the figure was standing at the edge of the water, its empty eye sockets staring directly at her. The falling leaves. Autumn in Oak Hollow was known for its picturesque trees. Every year, tourists flocked to the small town to marvel at the vibrant red and orange leaves that line the streets. But last October, the townsfolk began to notice something strange. The leaves didn't just fall, they drifted purposefully, almost like they were watching. At first, it was subtle, a few leaves swirling unnaturally toward people as they walked. But soon, the leaves began clinging to anyone who passed beneath the trees. A local teenager, Aaron, decided to test the rumor, standing under the oldest oak in town as the wind blew. A single red leaf floated down and landed on his shoulder. Aaron laughed, brushing it off. But as the leaf fell to the ground, it turned black and crumbled to ash. Over the next few days, Aaron's skin began to change. Dark veins spread beneath his flesh, and his eyes turned a dull, lifeless gray. By the time his parents brought him to the hospital, it was too late. That Halloween, the trees were bare. No one dared to walk under them again. The bonfire ritual. Every year, the students of Black Hollow University gathered in the woods for an illegal bonfire. It was a tradition meant to celebrate the arrival of fall, an evening of drinking, laughter, and telling scary stories. But last year, the bonfire tradition ended forever. The students arrived in pairs and groups, carrying firewood and booze. By the time the fire roared to life, the forest glowed in flickering oranges and reds. A girl named Rachel stood near the fire, feeling the warmth on her face as someone started a story about a witch who cursed the woods centuries ago. "Be careful where you walk," the storyteller warned, smirking. "They say the witch still watches from the shadows, looking for someone to take her place." Everyone laughed. It was just a story, after all. But as Rachel glanced at the trees, she noticed something odd. Figure standing just beyond the firelight, their bodies shadowed but their eyes glinting like distant stars. "Who's out there?" she asked. The others looked but saw nothing. They teased her for being paranoid, and the party continued. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As the fire crackled, sparks flew high into the night, and the figures began to move closer. Rachel saw their faces now, twisted and featureless, as though carved from the bark of the surrounding trees. Their mouths opened wide, and she heard a sound like the wind through dead leaves, low, hollow, and hungry. The fire suddenly dimmed, its flames shrinking as though suffocated. Screams erupted as the shadowed figures lunged into the circle of light. The forest swallowed the bonfire whole. When dawn came, the clearing was empty. All that remained was the cold, smoldering ashes of the fire, and a single carved wooden figure left standing in the center of the clearing. Its face was Rachel's. The Whispering Crow. Eliza loved birds. Her yard was filled with feeders, and her favorite visitor was a large black crow she called Edgar. Every fall, Edgar returned to perch on the old oak tree near her porch, calling loudly for treats. But this year, Edgar brought something with him. At first, it was a small thing. Eliza noticed Edgar watching her more closely than usual, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. He no longer called but made soft, low murmurs, almost like a human voice. She laughed it off, calling him her chatty boy. Then, one evening, she heard a whisper. "Eliza." She froze, glancing toward the oak tree. Edgar sat there, his black feathers gleaming in the moonlight. His beak didn't move, but the whisper came again, clearer this time. "Eliza, come here." She stepped outside, her heart pounding. "Edgar?" she asked softly. The bird tilted its head again, its beady eyes reflecting the porch light. Slowly, it opened its wings, revealing something clutched in its claws, a small, brittle bone. Eliza gasped, stumbling back inside. She locked the door and refused to go near the oak tree again. But the whispers didn't stop. Every night, she heard her name called, first softly, then insistently. One morning, Edgar was gone. Relieved, Eliza stepped onto the porch, only to find the year littered with bones. They formed a perfect circle around her house. The corn maze that moved. The Harrow family corn maze was a staple of fall festivities. Families visited from miles around to wander the winding paths and enjoy the crisp autumn air. This year, the maze was bigger and more intricate than ever. But as people entered, rumors began to spread. Some visitors swore the paths changed as they walked. What had been a dead end moments ago now led deeper into the maze. Others claimed they heard footsteps behind them, though no one was there. A group of teenagers decided to test the rumors one chilly October night. Armed with flashlights, they entered the maze after hours, laughing and daring each other to split up. They quickly regretted it. The maze seemed alive. Walls of corn shifted when they weren't looking, trapping them in tight, suffocating paths. The sound of rustling stalks surrounded them, and shadows flitted just out of sight. "Guys, stop messing around," one of them shouted, but no one was near him. He turned a corner and froze. There, standing in the middle of the path, was a scarecrow. Its burlap face was twisted into a grotesque grin, and its straw arms were stretched wide as if to welcome him. He backed away, only to bump into another scarecrow. Then another. They were everywhere now, closing in. The next morning, the Harrow family opened the maze as usual. But deep within its twisting paths, a new scarecrow stood, wearing a hoodie that looked eerily familiar. The maple tree's hunger. The McAllister family's maple tree was the pride of their property. Every fall, it exploded into brilliant shades of crimson and gold, drawing the admiration of neighbors and passers-by. But this year, the tree began dropping more than just leaves. It started small, a torn piece of fabric caught in its branches. Then a single muddy shoe appeared at its base. By October, the family found bones tangled among the roots, half buried in the soil. Mrs. McAllister begged her husband to cut the tree down, but he refused. "It's just animals," he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. One stormy night, their youngest daughter, Sophie, went missing. They searched the woods, the fields, and every corner of the house, but she was nowhere to be found. Then Mrs. McAllister saw it, a small hand dangling from the branches of the maple tree. She screamed for her husband, but when they ran outside, the hand was gone. The tree stood silent, its leaves shimmering in the rain. The next morning, the maple's roots had grown thicker, spreading farther across the lawn. The McAllisters moved away that winter, but the tree still stands, its crimson leaves darker than any others in the neighborhood. The Lantern Man. The town of Hollow Creek had a legend about the Lantern Man, a figure who appeared every autumn near the marshlands. Locals said he was a spirit, guiding travelers with his lantern's golden glow, though no one who followed him ever returned. Naomi didn't believe in ghost stories, but she'd heard about the Lantern Man her whole life. One evening in late October, she was walking home along the edge of the marsh when she spotted a light bobbing in the distance. Probably just a camper, she thought, though the marsh wasn't exactly a popular camping spot. She ignored it and kept walking. But the light moved closer, cutting through the gathering fog. It wasn't a flashlight or a phone, it was an old, flickering lantern. A figure appeared behind the light, his face obscured by shadows. He didn't call out or wave, just stood there, holding the lantern aloft. Naomi's skin prickled as a chill ran down her spine. She quickened her pace. As she walked faster, the light followed, always staying just far enough behind her. Naomi broke into a run, heart pounding in her chest. The path grew darker, the trees closing in, and still, the lantern followed, its glow now unnaturally bright. When she finally reached her front porch, the light disappeared. She slammed the door behind her, panting. But as she turned to look out the window, her blood ran cold. The lantern man stood in her yard, the lantern held high, his face now visible. It was her own face, staring back at her with hollow, lifeless eyes. The abandoned orchard. The Wilson orchard had been closed for years, its trees left to grow wild and unruly. But every fall, rumors spread that people saw lights moving through the overgrown fields, and some swore they heard children laughing. Kayla and her friends decided to check it out on Halloween night. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they snuck under the rusted gate and into the orchard. The trees loomed above them, their branches clawing at the sky. Rotted apples littered the ground, their sickly sweet scent thickened the air. "Smells like death," one of the boys joked, kicking an apple aside. The laughter came first, faint and high-pitched, drifting through the trees. Kayla froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Probably just the wind," someone said, though their voice trembled. The group pressed on, their flashlights sweeping over gnarled trunks and tangled branches. Then they saw it, a figure standing among the trees. It looked like a child, its head tilted, one hand clutching an apple. "Hey, kid, you okay?" one of the boys called, but the figure didn't move. Kayla stepped closer, her flashlight trembling in her hand. As the beam landed on the figure's face, she gasped. It wasn't a child. Its face was smooth and featureless, as though carved from wood, with deep grooves where the eyes should have been. The figure dropped the apple, and suddenly, more shapes emerged from the shadows, all holding rotting fruit in their hands. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the trees. The group ran, tripping over roots and fallen branches. When they reached the gate, Kayla glanced back. The figure stood in a line, watching them, the apples in their hands now dripping with dark, oozing liquid. The house that grew. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, a strange house appeared overnight. No one saw the moving trucks or construction crews. One day, the lot on Elm Street was empty, and the next, a two-story Victorian stood there as though it had always been part of the neighborhood. The house was old-fashioned, with peeling paint and a sagging porch. But its strangest feature was that it seemed to change every time someone looked at it. One moment, it had a single chimney, the next, there were two. Windows appeared and disappeared like blinking eyes. Curious, a man named Greg decided to knock on the door one October afternoon. He stepped onto the porch, but the wood felt wrong under his feet, soft, like damp soil. The door creaked open before he could knock. "Hello?" he called, but the house was silent. He stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath him. The interior was nothing like he'd expected. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting not his own face, but the faces of strangers, some smiling, some screaming. The air smelled of rot, and the deeper he went, the harder it became to turn around. When Greg finally reached the back of the house, he found a single door. It was painted bright red, and as he touched the handle, he heard whispers coming from the other side. "Welcome home," they said. No one saw Greg again. A week later, the house was gone, leaving behind an empty lot covered in withered leaves and dying grass.